We want to know what is the purpose of 3 to 5 rounds of interviews. I know different companies have different processes. They do
Yeah.
things for specific reasons. But can you just sum it up for us? Just give us like an idea why these like 3, 5 rounds of interviews, and sometimes you don't even give us the job after those rounds of interviews.
Okay, my question is, how many interviews would you expect to have?
2.
Why?
Because one will be technical, right? You want to check
Yeah.
my skill level, right? The other one, get to know me, what type of person I am, culture fit, will I fit here, and yeah, a bit about my background, work ethic, that type of thing. So I would think 2 interviews are sufficient.
Okay, so to answer your question, uh, let me give you a bit of background, right? So normally when we do interview processes, especially as
Mhm.
external recruiters, there's something called the preliminary screening, right?
Mhm.
So we have a short list of maybe, if we're looking for something within the mid range, we're probably getting anything between 100 to 150 applicants. No,
Mhm.
100, about 300 applicants on
Mhm.
average, right? Out of that 150, there's probably only 50 quality candidates. Within
Mhm.
those 50 quality candidates, there are those who CV were probably already on the system and they are automatically applied. And so we now need to find the quality candidates. So the first step we do is a screening. So one, we want to establish whether or not you're actually saying what you can say. I know that during one of my segments, I asked somebody somebody asked me a question around, why do recruiters like asking us questions that are on our CVs? And I'm just like, because
Mhm.
baby, y'all be typing you like. And when I start asking questions, that's when I hear her, no, man, because you, for example, get like a crazy job title, like, a delivery, consultant. And then a
Right.
driver will apply for a job,
Okay.
and I'm
Mhm.
very simple example, but people don't read job specs anymore because they're tired and they're frustrated. So you have people who are applying for jobs, they're using, ChatGPT systems, meshing something together and sending it through. So I am the first sift to say, okay, that 20-minute call, sometimes it's 30 minutes. I want to hear you are who you say you are. One. Two,
Okay.
I also want to lock you in on a few things, right? I want to know whether or not your salary range is within what my client's willing to pay. I want
Okay.
to know what are your salient factors, right? So things that would literally stop me from closing the deal. So, for example, if you tell me, Hore, oh no, you live in a different city and you're not willing to relocate. If I hear a dog in the background and I'm like, are you willing to relocate and leave your dog behind? Like, these seem like very frivolous things. But when I tell you there was a time where I had a very senior exec guy living in the UK that I wanted to bring back to SA, and the interview process went like a charm, right?
Yeah.
Until the client said, no, no, we'll pay for the relocation cost, but we won't pay for his 2 dogs to travel. When I tell you that man declined the offer. So these are the preliminary screening things that we do at the beginning of the interview process, just to make sure that we weed out, those initial steps. So
Okay.
that's number one. That's basic. And that you will always get more often
Okay.
than not.
Okay.
Yes, it's an automated system, and then they say, okay, fine, yes, you've been accepted, do a technical assessment. So then, which brings me to the second part, which is technical assessments or technical interview, which is what you mentioned, where
Mhm.
they want to assess your technical competency. Now, you must understand the tech industry is not your normal industry, right?
Mm.
Tech has been an industry that has been continuously evolving and rapidly so. I remember the second I was studying, they would tell me, Hore, by the time the textbook goes to print, that information is already obsolete. So you can understand how dynamic this environment is. And because of that, um, tech has a lot more barriers to entry from an interview process standpoint. But
Mm.
also, you must that South Africa is one of the most complex markets to get into, because
Mhm.
once you hire an income person, you can't fire them. not
Okay.
without a lot of red tape, not without the CCMA. So they will put a lot of barriers to entry to make sure that they actually get quality candidates. So
Mm.
within that technical assessment, some, in normal interviews, they would, yes, some of them do have technical assessments and psychometric assessments depending on the scope of the job. But more often than not, it will be a technical interview where there's a hiring manager and sometimes HR is there, sometimes they're not, sometimes one of their future peers will be there as well,
Mm.
where they're trying
Okay.
to see how
Culture.
you
And
can, sometimes they use it as a culture fit, sometimes it's not a culture fit, sometimes it's
mm.
just technical. And when they add more people, then they want to see the complexities of what you can do. Sometimes they split up the technical interview and the culture interview. That's when you start getting your 3 to 5s,
Okay.
because a culture interview, different interview altogether. So there, I remember I used to work for another fintech, and that culture interview, people would fail it like crazy. I said, sorry, what? And unfortunately, I didn't have scope because the client knew I'd brief my candidates. But in that culture interview, they normally get people from different departments, or they'll get people within your department, depending on how much the company values culture. And you'll
Okay.
see during the interview process, oh, okay, they'll either put you with your peers, so people who you'll be working with on a day-to-day basis, see if you guys gel. And then if it's a global company, sometimes what they'll do is give you people in a different department to sit with you and see whether or not you're progressive enough to work on a global scale. And a
Mm.
lot of people actually, which is crazy, but it happens. And then there's also the panel interview. So the more senior you are, the more senior people that you'll sit with, and then they also assess you on that particular scale. And then sometimes that's also known as a stakeholder interview. So stakeholders like the final decision maker, the final boss. If he's happy, everybody's happy. And then throughout that, there's also your checks. So there's something called an MIE check. So
Okay.
once everybody's satisfied, they start running your check. So typically, what you'd find in checks is your criminal check and background. If it's a global company, they'll do a background of your employee to just make sure you worked where you said you were working during those particular times. And then they also do your qualification checks.
Mm.
And they also do your fingerprint to just make sure that you are who you say you are.
Mm. Okay.
And then if you're entering into the finance market within the tech space, then there's
Mm.
also something, they'll also run a credit check.
Yeah. Yeah.
And unfortunately, and this is from a South African context, more people are in debt than we'd like. So much so, there was a fintech I was working for, and their typical interview process was, pre-screening, interview, assessment, final stakeholder, then checks, then offer
Mm.
and onboarding. When it came to South African, the South African context, it was pre-screening checks. I was like, yo, because a lot of our people are in debt and they can't have you work within the financial industry. And I found it very interesting, but it was the reality.
Think now, even if you are not in a financial industry, do you see that these financial checks now, even people who are not in the financial industry, they do now get, like, I know someone who couldn't work at a call center. Just at a call center, it was not a fintech, it was not a finance space, it was just like customer service. But they said because they're in like blacklisted, they can't get a job. But from a fintech or finance perspective, I understand. But other markets, like other industries, why is it? Why have you seen that? Like maybe from your colleagues?
I have, and I'll tell you why. And I think call centers are a perfect example. So you must understand that industries that use a lot of call centers are predominantly in the financial services space. So
Oh.
if they're not selling, they're selling something that deals with money. And
Mm.
unfortunately, the risk is you can get connections and help, override the system. Sometimes the client says, if you're dealing with a financial services client, they will tell you that these are no-nos. So in order for me to keep business with that particular, organization, I can't have that risk. And sometimes you find that even though that call center may not necessarily work within the finance division 100% and they deal with different industries, one of their clients may be in the financial services industry, and it makes it then hard to move you from one department to another because they're not going to do those background checks again. So yeah, that's one of the spaces.
Unfair.
But on the other hand, if there are also financial checks and they're not within the financial industry, I think you do have somewhat of a leg to stand on to push back and take them to task. They have to give you yeah.
Before you even enter, I think that one. Let's be honest. You're not gonna win.
One of the things that really frustrate me with our current job market is we're not angry enough.
Yeah.
Right? What do I mean by that? Sometimes you have to take companies to task, even if they discriminate. For example, if I'm pregnant and I go for a job interview and I feel like they're discriminating me based on, the fact that I've disclosed that I'm pregnant, you can actually take some companies to task because they're not allowed to discriminate. That's why firing in South Africa is such a hectic thing, because there's the CCMA that protects employees from these type of things. So I just think that there's so many different ways that we can have these conversations and, platforms, a lot of South Africans don't use Reddit as much as they should, because these are areas where you can call companies to task as a collective so that people can know, oh, no, don't blacklist me, let's blacklist them. And then there's also platforms like Glassdoor where you can also state, no, man, I feel like they discriminated me based on XYZ. Now you must also understand the industry that they're in. I think a lot of people get really lazy when it comes to researching and doing their background checks. Understand the industry that you're going to get into, because when you understand the industry, you also get to have a better feel in terms of which platforms are a lot more common. You start joining network groups with people within those familiar industries. So it's easy to then tap into, ask them those questions. Another thing about technical interviews is do mock interviews, please. Just do
But
mock interviews.
tell us where can we do them?
So, firstly is downloading typical questions you'd find within this industry. Google is your friend.
Right.
Even recruiters, God bless their soul, will also go on those platforms and ask those questions, especially if a hiring manager doesn't say, this is what I'm specifically looking for. You guys are using the same internet to draft those questions. And I would take it a step further and say, LinkedIn is also a great platform. So normally when you apply for a job, after you apply for a job, LinkedIn will say, hey, these are standard interview questions and answers, and get into it. And yeah, so do mock interviews. And I always say with mock interviews, remember, an interview is an area where you can literally show off without anyone feeling bad about you showing off, right? Because you need to put your best foot forward. So it is important, for example, if they ask you a question, think of look for all these questions and answers. And then I always say, find your star player quality that you can, or star event that you can attach to that answer. What do I, for example, I'm going to use myself as an example because top of mind.
Yeah.
If I get asked, oh, how good of you are you a recruiter, whatever, I'd be like, listen, I closed the company's annual target in a single month by placing at one company with 3 candidates. Why? Right. Because we got exclusivity at 25%, and I could have stopped there, but but that wasn't the only thing that I closed. Yeah. What does that mean? You why you need to hire me, because any business, you must understand, companies hire assets. The thing is, a lot of people think companies hire people. Businesses don't need more people. Businesses need problem solvers. So you must do your research when it comes to a company. And I know I'm deviating, but it's very important for the kids to know. When you go for an interview, the one most important thing you must do is establish the hiring manager's pain point and find it quickly. And how do you find that? You look at the company. Are they on the news? What problem are they currently having on the news? And whatever interview question, when you do your mock interviews, find an example that you can extract that will speak to their heart center about a problem that they're currently facing. And one question I really, really like as a candidate asking a hiring manager is, what's the one thing that keeps you up at night in this department? And they will tell you, oh, no, hey, high absentee. No, my team does it, or that. And you keep that answer at the back of your mind and find an example towards the end of the interview that you can drop. That will then make it sound like you fixing their problem. And I like one thing I always do, like in corporate, I always tell them, I'm like, listen, my job is to make your job easier. Tell me how I can make your job easier.
That's it.
Because that's it. That's what they want to hear. Want to hear to make yours easier, because you must understand, Hore, and this is where I think the South African job market gets a little bit dizzy, because hey, why doesn't my manager care about my growth? Because they're too focused on theirs.